Welcome to Hard Fork, recorded live in the eye of the hyper-Bitcoinization hurricane, coming at you from the frontier of the fourth turning and counting down the final hours of the fiat economy. My name is Julian Farah, and I am joined by my brother, co-founder, and co-host, Thomas. Thomas, you ready? We're going to do this?
Let's do it. Yeah, let's go.
All right. Well, today we are talking about accelerationism, the philosophy of accelerationism, the effective accelerationism, EAC variety that spawned recently in the kind of tech AI world, and maybe a Bitcoin fork or Bitcoin branch that might be spawning as well. So we're going to talk about all those things and more in just a moment. Stay tuned. Yes, we are back, and we are here to talk about accelerating and accelerationism. Well, let's jump in, because before we get into the kind of AI and in EAC part of it, the idea is massive technological changes are inevitable, having been set in motion, and they are and being inevitable, it's kind of futile to resist them. And so, the way to orient oneself towards these massive technological and societal changes is to just try to get through to the end of them, to let these processes play out, and in fact to help them along. Hence accelerate.
Well, look, I would say, I think that's an accurate representation. I really liked Joe Clarence had a basically summary of effective accelerationism, which is to say it aims to follow the will of the universe, basically leaning into the thermodynamic bias towards a future with greater and smarter civilizations that are more effective at finding and extracting free energy from the universe and converting it to utility and at grander and grander scales. So, which is to say, this is this inevitable phenomenon that's happening amongst, and it has been happening forever. It is the will of the universe. It's simply a question of how much do we want to fight it versus how much do we want to embrace it.
Yeah. I think to expand a little bit on some of the ideas here, this is my understanding. And now I suppose we're talking about effective accelerationism in particular, and maybe just by way of context, there is now, I guess, a burgeoning movement in tech, founded by, at least in part by, I guess the person who seems to be the main character of this whole thing is kind of an anon account, or recently doxed, but let's say an anon account by a guy by the name of Jeff Bezos, wrote this manifesto. I believe there's somebody else, but wrote this manifesto about effective accelerationism, where it kind of spells some of this out. And as you said, what does this manifesto talk about? It's this idea that the universe itself favors or falls on the side of a kind of resource allocation that kind of maximizes entropy and kind of is most efficiently distributed through kind of chaotic emergent processes. And so, therefore, anything that kind of gets in the way of these chaotic emergent resource allocation processes is bad, right? And that would be, broadly speaking, central planning would be one kind of manifestation of this, right? Like, in other words, the best system that is in line with this, what he and they would say is, I guess, this truth about the universe, the best human system that approximates this would be free market capitalism.
Right.
And that anything, a central planned economy would be something that, because it simply cannot do the job correctly of ingesting all the data about the economy and reallocating resources efficiently and effectively. Central planning is kind of bunk, slows things down, and basically should be rejected.
In some sense, to be an effective, like an accelerationist, is to have humility in the sense of appreciating you don't have all of the information to control it. Like, who can actually put a stop to it? I mean, in order to be a decel, you essentially have to want some kind of centralizing force that says this is the right way to move and this is the wrong way to move. And you know in advance, you have all of the information out there about everything to decide, to make that decision about the way the universe, or certainly, we as a civilization should operate. But that's why it's philosophically, it's about having a sense of, I would say it's about a humility in understanding that no one of us can possibly know, like, be that central God that actually decides what technology is going to be most helpful for us as a civilization and what we should be slowing down. I mean, if you looked at decels in history, it's not a new phenomenon, right? We're talking about decels existed when at the creation of the printing press, for example, amongst a million other
Yeah, I
things.
mean,
It's
there's
a
a way in which
recurring thing.
there's a way in which you can just somewhat straightforwardly just map D cells to Luddites.
Right.
A D cell is, and I think this is the way that a lot of people are kind of using this term D cell in public and on Twitter, is just, if you're a Luddite, you're a D cell. And if you're a D cell, you're a Luddite. And that basically anybody that's kind of anti-tech or anti-tech progress, or certainly pro-regulation, kind of falls into this. I think it's maybe somewhat of a crude demarcation, but this is what you have. You have your kind of Luddites and your technologists.
Yeah, where I think it gets interesting is that we live in a time in which you have, see, it is slightly, I will admit, it's a bit of a straw man to refer to them as Luddites, only because it's a new kind, which is to say, it's sort of like this camp is typically, they're often technologists themselves, but it's a leftist technologist that believes they know what's the right technology to create and what's the wrong technology to create. And more importantly, they want the government to decide what technology is right and wrong. So in some sense, in some sense, your views on that can come down to just your level of trust, I suppose, in having a kind of a centralizing counterforce that can have this control.
Well, this is Balaji's interpretation, right, on this more. I think you're kind of steering into this direction, like Balaji Srinivasan's interpretation of what these camps are. Your EACs and sub branches and your D cells, and he kind of plots this spectrum of, I think, like D cell through to Bitcoiner, right? And this is kind of spectrum where Bitcoiner is the least trusting, and your D cell, who necessarily are advocates for government regulation, they are your most trusting of the government. Here's what I think, and we'll kind of get into now, like, what do we make of this? What do we make of accelerationism, effective acceleration, in particular, accelerationism, and not just how it's kind of defined, but also the kind of meme craft of it, and how it seems to be playing out, like the kind of info war and propaganda war that seems to be playing out. Because, as I said, from a propaganda point of view, I do see these kind of fairly neat camps forming where you have your accelerationist, pro-technology, regulation minimists, and then you have everybody else that kind of gets chucked into this Luddite regulator, doomer buckets. And that's kind of, I think it's effective propaganda. But, for me, if we were to just stop there and say, like, yeah, EAC and accelerationism is pro-tech, anti-regulation, anti-government control of tech in particular, I would say, great. Sounds good to me. Like, sign me up. And if it was purely, and the more esoteric part about it, of like, well, it's these kind of observations of resource allocation, general principles of truth, how the universe likes to operate. Sure, sounds good to me. But there's a little bit more to that beneath the meme craft of it. If you read the manifesto, I think the views of these EAC people, certainly some of the early ones, need to be examined a little bit closer, because there's more under the hood, right? For one thing, there's a lot of like unashamed and in fact proud transhumanism, right? I think in the manifesto, Beth even describes herself as a post-humanist. Right? Now, again, I don't know how much of this stuff is memeing, right, and how much of it's for effect, and it might be a lot of it. But but it makes sense to me. If you take this idea of accelerating maximally to its logical conclusion, particularly with AI, you do run into certain ideas of, well, melding of humans with machines and hive mind AI consciousness and all this kind of stuff. And so, do you have to buy into that? If you buy into, like, to me, there's the circumscribed vision of this stuff, which is just like pro-capitalism, pro-techno-capital, is actually quite different from saying, no, like, we are a AI maximalist, post-humanist, transhumanists. Like, for me, I don't buy into that. That latter part of it for different reasons. And I think when we talk about Bitcoin, perhaps we can kind of explain why. But the former, yeah, I get it, and that makes sense to me.
Well, the thing is that when you look at these sort of technological acceleration on some of like the transhumanist or the basically combining humans with machines, essentially. The issue to me, the dividing line between what's ethical and what's right, comes down to freedom. And that is to say, if you create some kind of technological innovation and you want to experiment on yourself via combining with machine, I say have at it. And you might make yourself into a god doing it. But if you come along, and say, we're going to create this chip that we're going to inject into all human beings because it's going to stop the next pandemic, for example, that's where I say, no.
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically, of course, we're talking about. But so that's where you get very interesting outcomes, where you might have technological innovation is like, great, let's welcome it. And I feel that way about, be it AI or gene editing and all kinds of technological innovation. I welcome the creation of it, provided with the proviso that it's not forced upon us. If people want to experiment on themselves, I think that's great. I think that's how we get the next, amazing outcomes for humanity. That this kind of experimentation, and I see it. It's not just obviously with AI or with chips, but there are people experiment. I mean, I don't know if you follow that guy that's the anti-aging guy. I forget his
Brian
name.
Johnson, yeah.
He's fascinating. Like that's absolutely fascinating. I wouldn't want to live his life, but experiment. Mess with your hormones, mess with your
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's funny you bring him up because he's an angel investor in Beth Bezos's AI startup, right? I mean, all this stuff.
It's the same philosophy.
It
Yeah.
converges, right? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I think that those people that are at the cutting edge they are, driving us forward, and I welcome it. What I don't want
yeah,
to see is systematic control of this technology by that can be forced upon us. And realistically, that's only possible via government, but it
yeah,
is possible via government. And I know there's a lot of you might call them right wing Luddites, basically, because they're scared of government enforcing these technologies upon them, and I think with good reason. But it doesn't necessarily mean you want to throw out the technology. AI could be used, you know, AI could be used terribly. It could be a massive centralizing force
yeah,
for um, operating as a command and control center of our
yeah,
I mean, AI could be the tool that helps unlock state planning in a way that previously hasn't been done before, and might unleash a
yeah.
string of, frankly, horrors upon civilizations. I believe that, but I also don't want to slow down AI, because I think the answer is actually more competition. The answer is, great, let's have not just one AI, let's have a lot of AIs. Let's open source it. Let's make it it's available to everybody.
The answer to slowing down AI to me is very simple. Like anybody that wants to do this, the rebuttal is, in my view, fairly straightforward, and it's a question, right? When someone says we need to slow down, we
Mm,
need to control AI, the first question is, well, who is we?
right.
You're talking about America? Because you're not going to make anyone in China slow down.
No.
You're not going to make anyone anywhere else in the world slow down. So who's we, firstly? And then if we is this net with a giant hole in it, then it's not going to do any good. Secondly, the question is, what does what does slowing down actually mean? Because what you're actually describing is the government, like you said, the government with the threat of violence, forcing people to not write computer code. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, and that it's an expression of ideas that are used to, like, ultimately the adoption of it will only come if it makes our lives better. I mean, nobody is going to be forced to use AI, but as you said, there's no stopping this train, because no, it's a sort of a connection problem where all these governments would have to, you know, interact together simultaneously, which is essentially impossible.
Yeah. And look, some of the doomers say that AI itself is going to figure all this stuff out and make it, it's kind of moot points because these complex questions will be out of our hands. Like one thing, actually Balaji, I think in the Network State book, he talks about this idea that there's this kind of truism that central planning at scale is basically impossible and always worse. But now it's conceivable. It's conceivable to imagine that like the Chinese Communist Party could have an AI that is capable of like ingesting every like the data on every transaction processed everywhere in the economy every day and like allocating resources accordingly. Like, so there are certain things that you just are kind of inconceivable from a human point of view with human capabilities, but we just don't know what the AIs will be able to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that's why you need to be very careful with your arguments. I mean, like, the argument against communism for that reason shouldn't be, oh, it's worse for GDP.
Yeah.
Because that might not be true forever.
Yeah,
Like that's
yeah,
not really the argument. It's actually a human spirit argument that
yeah, yeah.
that could be
But so you're 100% correct. You're 100% correct, I think. But this is why I think this is why I like have this kind of involuntary revulsion at the idea of wholeheartedly embracing this kind of post-humanism idea, because it feels like a decision that you only get to make once, firstly, and if we don't have the human spirit as the kind of the ultimate arbiter or ultimate judge, then what do we have?
Yeah, we need to be I mean, look, the starting point has to be about making our lives better. If that's not the starting point, I think it's an absurd philosophy. I think this way. I think this way a lot about the way nation states operate, where they do things constantly that are simultaneously both in the interest of the nation state, but also make the lives of their citizens much worse.
Yeah,
And this is the conflict that we have to be constantly battling. Um,
yeah.
and
But conversely, it is possible to imagine a state that actually is good at its job, right? That can make the lives of its citizens better. I know it's hard to imagine because we don't have many of those today, but it actually is possible.
it is possible theoretically. You just need you need the right starting ideals. For example, the goal needs to be from the beginning. We're going to make the lives of our citizens better,
Yeah,
as opposed to if you look at most nations today, they operate they're optimizing conditions are like, let's optimize for GDP.
yeah.
Like they optimize for GDP,
Growth.
or they optimize for growth. I mean, that's the fundamental, and that's actually why it's very difficult, because that's such a human nature thing. Every
Yeah,
collective human organization, whether it be a club, a government, a business, something about us as human beings, we have to have growth, and it becomes this almost it's like the it's like it's like the societal cancer. We have this immediate need for constant growth, or and uh, I don't know how to fix that from a governing perspective. I don't know if it's possible actually to have a society that doesn't need that. And so,
well, I think it's not necessarily cancerous. A, a couple of things, and I don't want to get sidetracked on this, but I think the growth preoccupation, in my view, is part of the Western spirit, part of the Western mind. The Western the Western man seeks expansion and new frontiers and conquest of those frontiers. And I think that's, well, it's a deep subject, but generally I think it can be pursued productively and beneficially. But I think in the societies that we live in now, it's not about that. It's about beating inflation. That's what the growth is about.
yeah, yeah. Let me be clear. Growth, growth is fine. I don't even, when I say it's like a foundational thing about it's not even like it's inbuilt in us that we need it, and it's not a good or a bad thing. But the problem is that if your optimizing conditions are wrong, if you're growing for the wrong like
Yeah,
you know, if growth is defined as increasing the quality of experience for the members of the thing that's growing, that's a great thing. If growth is defined as increasing GDP, you
Yeah.
start getting all these messy outcomes.
Yeah. I
You
mean,
have all these.
cancer is probably the right analogy. Like cell replication to make number go up is like
Right.
the definition. Is like the definition of cancer, right?
Yeah, this is just the way our cells operate, and it's just seems that it's like a fractal amongst in the universe. It operates at the cellular level, and it operates at the human interaction level, so social
Yeah.
level as well.
Yeah.
It operates on every level.
Let's move on now and talk about Bitcoin, and maybe this can be the final topic, and kind of tie all these subjects together, because Bitcoin Bitcoin itself, and in particular, uh, bit, the idea of Bitcoin accelerationism has an interesting role to play here. And we already talked about how maybe someone like Balaji has kind of put Bitcoin on this accel decel spectrum. I believe Beth even put out a tweet himself where he basically said, and to me it was an incoherent tweet, but he said EAC is Bitcoin, and then he said DAC, like the letter DAC, which is the decentralization fork of EAC. He paired that with Ethereum of all things. So that's why I say it was kind of an incoherent tweet. Nonetheless, this is what's going on. People are talking about, okay, well, what are these other technologies that we have that that dovetail with some of the ideas in effective accelerationism? And is Bitcoin accelerationism, or BAC, a fork of that? Is it part of that? What do we think? Now, my view is I think Bitcoin is not a fork of anything. I think EAC can fuck off if it thinks it's some umbrella parent philosophy, which, like Bitcoin, something as magnificent and world changing as Bitcoin, as if that like rolls up to EAC. I mean, I think this is a joke, and I'm personally not going to participate in this in that way. But the ideas are related. Here's how I would kind of sketch it out. I would say money is information, right? In a market economy, it's this information is one of the roles that it plays. Allowing people to communicate about what is valuable and why. When you have fiat currencies, the currencies are debased, and it degrades the ability for money to play this information role, right? For like allocating resources throughout an economy. And so, what does this have to do with EAC? Well, I mean, as we talked about, there's this idea with the accelerationist guys, is this kind of idea of emphasizing efficient resource allocation and the evolution towards more complex systems, the kind of anti-central planning. So it has that in common with Bitcoin. And so in a sense, like Bitcoin is this perfect money information that we have. And so any system predicated on the proper allocation of resources, any system or set of ideas predicated on like efficiency and projection of value into the future, I think necessarily has to care about Bitcoin. And so I would say actually Bitcoin actually underlies any other philosophies that want to build on top of it in that way.
Well, EAC very specifically, as with that Joe Clarence quote, it's about utilizing energy in the universe. And there's no greater force for utilizing and promoting energy utilization in amongst humans than Bitcoin, because we're now able to tap and access energy for Bitcoin mining that is disconnected from human populations, right? So we can access, there's a lot of effectively stranded energy that has no access to humans that we can now make effective use of in the form of bringing out, literally placing miners in the middle of nowhere and accessing, be it a waterfall or solar or any of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's accessing energy. But I also think it's an acceleration from the perspective of revolutionary, in the sense of just ushering in a new era, a new world. I think it will be an era of completely, in our lifetimes, an unprecedented era of prosperity, because all of the big problems that we see today they're funded based off of stolen money, basically, because it's very easy to fund them when you have fiat money and there's no limit to fiat money and you can always allocate resources to that. But it becomes very difficult to do so when you've got this finite resource that is the money, right? So by adopting Bitcoin, you're accelerating into a world where you've got finite money and you cannot
Yeah.
people are allocating to this horror show without even realizing it. And they're not even psychologically aware of it, or maybe on some level they are, but there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. And so Bitcoin is this accelerating force to actually end that.
Yeah.
Um,
So you're right. Bitcoin, if you want to talk, the idea of acceleration operates on several levels simultaneously. And there's one, that kind of higher level definition of accelerationism that we started the show with, which was just fast forwarding the decline of incumbent or establishment systems so that they are replaced with newer ones. Something like that. In that context, yeah, I would say Bitcoin for sure is just an accelerant on this. What it is it's an accelerant on the decline of fiat. Like, were it not for Bitcoin, fiat would survive much longer. It wouldn't survive forever. But I think undoubtedly Bitcoin is and will continue to hasten its decline. Incidentally, which is why some of the enemies of Bitcoin are actually quite astute and correct when they see it as a threat. And I think if we're being honest about that as Bitcoiners, we would say, yeah, they're on the money there. Because what are we trying to do if not trying to end fiat?
And the thing is that without Bitcoin, fiat could go actually forever. And the reason why is because it's quite simply, it's like, yes, today's fiat will die. That's how it works. But they can, you have a situation where there's always the next fiat coming along. They like in a world without Bitcoin, right? Where does this go? It has to. The obvious answer is CBDC, or essentially a system reboot, just like we've had in the past. There's nothing stopping another system reboot into more different fiats. It won't be
Just rebasing.
a global coin.
Yeah, true.
So
And Bitcoin does fix this. Now, I want to move on to I guess what I would like to kind of finish up with, and it's maybe I don't have concrete answers here, but it's something that I think is kind of thought provoking, and maybe we can discuss a little bit and leave it to come back to. But so as we talked about, there's this idea that you can be an accelerationist and a Bitcoiner, and these two things go together. But I guess the question I have is, what does it mean to be an accelerationist Bitcoiner? In other words, within this process of Bitcoinization that we're going through, you can have slower, like with AI, you can have a slower version and you can have a faster version.
yeah.
And in my view, we at least need to talk about this and consider it very carefully because, look, as we just talked about, where we are intentionally hastening the decline of fiat. And so then you have to, if you're being honest, being really honest, I think, as a Bitcoiner, you have to answer this question. What does it mean to end fiat? Like, who are the stakeholders that are going to be affected by this positively and negatively? Who are the people that are maybe reliant, dependent on fiat today that are going to, well, run the risk of getting rug pulled? Like, these are, I think, real questions. And so we can talk a little bit about it now. Maybe we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but this is broadly what I think. There is a Bitcoin, let's say a Bitcoin accelerationist who says, I want to end fiat and I want to end it as fast as possible. And I want maximum Bitcoin adoption, maximum Bitcoin usage, and maximum, with perhaps collateral damage, destruction of fiat. And then you might have your, let's say, decel Bitcoiners who say, well, yes, fiat is evil, and yes, Bitcoin is the solution, but what about welfare states? For example, what do we do about that? So anyway, that's how I would sketch out this spectrum.
Well, I have a question to ponder. I mean, you have based on philosophical beliefs, understanding about the actual process and the damage money printing causes, you have certain political movements like MMT come along. This, it seems to have come and gone, but may come back again.
Just briefly, you want to give a 2-sentence introduction to MMT?
Yeah, I mean, modern monetary theory, basically the idea that there's no limit to, basically the idea that you can spend as much money, the government, I should say, can spend as much money as it wants, and the only limit to government spending money is inflation. Now, that's a contradiction in its own right, because when the government is creating new money, that is inflation. Yes, but they have a very special way of defining, which is actually how the governments do it today, which is they define inflation by CPI. And so then they think, well, if we can spend the money, we can create new money without, affecting CPI too much, because we play games with CPI. And then the only limit on spending is, we just don't want CPI to get too high. Now, it's inherently a contradiction, because money creation is literally inflation. That's what it is. But in a world where you say, no, I define inflation this way, and it's by the price of basket of goods of these things, and, if we can, as long as we can suppress this basket, we can print as much money.
Which, by the way, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that suppression is like hitting people with extra taxes.
Well, that's where they say the reason the tax element comes in is because the logical conclusion would be, hey, if the government has no limit on spending, infinite spending, why would you have any taxation at all? And their response is, you use the only purpose of taxation is to limit inflation. So basically, it's like, we need to increase taxes to offset the consumer price index. Now, what that theory is, another way of explaining it is basically communism. What you have is, you have the government controls all of the resources in the economy and has the ability to access all of the resources. And with that, there's no limit to their spending. They can spend as much dollars as they want, and effectively, just when you're spending dollars, you're just taking resources from the private economy and extracting and bringing it to the government economy. Now, it's a horror show of philosophy. I think that's clearly true. But this is where it gets interesting. You, as a Bitcoiner, if you believe that the other side of Bitcoin is an amazing world, and you're also presented with this MMT philosophy, which I guarantee you will accelerate the path to a Bitcoinized world, right? It's just going to accelerate the destruction of fiat money at a much faster pace than it already is. So then it's like, what do you want to actually happen? Because it's like, basically, are you willing to support the collapse before the rise? Or accelerate.
And this is where accelerationism can get, or the critique of it is that it can be a little bit nihilistic, right? This is kind of the critique of the Landian, the kind of general Landian vision of accelerationism, which is just like pedal to the metal, let's just let everything collapse, because it's a bit nihilistic, like if you're an accelerationist Bitcoiner and you say like, and you for tactical reasons prop up the arguments of like MMTers, even though they kind of in a sense are your mortal enemy.
Yeah.
Like just how cynical are you willing to be? Well, so the critique would be, just how cynical are you willing to be to pump your bags, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's kind of incoherent, or at least feels a bit silly in a sense, to be kind of all in Bitcoin, like fiat is ending, I'm on the Bitcoin life raft, and I'm gonna what? I'm gonna like vote for politicians who promise to like, tinker around the edges of like fiscal reform and be like a little bit more responsible. Like, I mean, we believe that the horse has already bolted, right? There is no saving this thing. I personally believe that. So if I believe that, like, what am I going to do? Vote for Ted Cruz to like shave a few $100 million off entitlement spending? Like, let's be serious. Let's actually be serious about this.
Yeah, look, I struggle with it myself. I mean, I think we can all. I mean, just look in the last couple of years. I would say the zero interest rate environment was destructive for our economy, our culture. It was destructive in every possible way. And then they've put a limit, like they basically just went too far to the point where too much inflation that people just were unwilling to live with that kind of inflation. So they put a big stop to it. They massively raised rates from 0 to 5%. I think culturally we're seeing, the world is a much better place, I would argue, today, end of 2023, than it was, say, two years ago.
Yeah. The vibe
In
shift
that,
is we can thank Jerome Powell for for it single-handedly.
enormously. But, there's no question. Part of me looks at it and goes, well, gee, when they cut rates from 5 back to 0, they're going to pump Bitcoin to oblivion. Like, they're going to send it to the moon. And that's going to be great for me personally, even as I watch this sort of crumbling civilization around me.
I know,
And
right?
I have mixed feelings about it. I do.
Yeah. Well, let's pause it there then, because I want to explore this idea more in future, but I don't want to force us to try and elaborate these positions of ours any more than we have formed right now. But I think this is a good starting point, kind of sketching out accelerationism, effective accelerationism, and what Bitcoin acceleration and accelerationism might have to do with it all. But I think that was great. So why don't we call it there, and I'll see you back for the next one.
Yeah, sounds good. Good chat.
See ya.